All right there, everyone. It's time to talk about the war of sorts that's broken out between Poland and the European Union and the lessons this war has to teach us. Breitbart ran a story on a senior Eurocrat who's accused Poland of abdicating its leading role in Central Europe by refusing to bend to the EU's demands on migrant quotas and internal judicial reforms. But what's so interesting was that in the process of making these observations, she ended up admitting that the nation of Poland poses a greater existential threat to the EU than does the Brexit. Now, this EU official, her name is Elżbieta Bieńkowska. She is herself Polish. She was appointed a Eurocrat by Donald Tusk, who's the current president of the European Council, but was also the former prime minister of Poland before his centrist globalist civic platform party was swept out of office by the current nationalist populist ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, in a landslide election defeat. And she said at an EU forum taking place in Poland that her nation, in refusing to accept the immigration quotas and judicial restraints and reforms imposed by the EU, has in effect abdicated its role as leader of Central Europe, and that it's going to take a very long time to rebuild this leadership position if it's even possible. Now, at issue is the way the Law and Justice Party plans to change how judges are hired and fired. And critics warn that this is going to give ministers too much political sway over the courts. Now, as far as the Law and Justice Party is concerned, these judicial reforms, these measures they're taking place in order to reduce the continued influence of holdovers from the country's Cold War era communist regime. But that doesn't matter to the EU, and it's threatening to suspend Poland's voting rights. And there's even talk of triggering what's called Article 7 of the EU Charter and temporarily booting Poland off the European Council, which has never been done before. But what's so interesting here is that this Eurocrat, this Elżbieta Bieńkowska, she went on to point out that the EU has to be very, very careful here. Because as she observed, Europe is currently going through what she calls a right-wing crisis. And this is happening even at the very ground zero of the EU, Angela Merkel's Germany. We saw the rise of the far right in Germany just this last round of elections with the AfD, or the Alternative for Germany party, which is barely 4 years old. It swept into office, winning just over 13% of the votes in the last round of elections just a few weeks back, which makes them the third largest political party in Germany and by far the most successful right-wing German party since World War II. We're seeing the rise of the Austrian right as well with the upcoming election there this weekend. Pundits they're already saying that the question is not whether Austria will turn to the right, but rather how far to the right will it go. That's how powerful the right has become in Austrian politics. And so this Eurocrat, this Elżbieta Bieńkowska, believes that the right-wing populism and nationalism that swept her nation, Poland, is more of a threat to the stability and unity of the EU than even the Brexit itself, which she seems to think is primarily an economic or democratic grievance and not really a nationalist movement. I beg to differ, but nevertheless. Now, in terms of this assertion that Poland is abdicating its leadership position in Europe, I said this before and it bears repeating. We had better be very, very weary whenever a globalist apologist warns a nation that it's abdicating its global leadership role because it's embracing its nationalist populist sentiments. We hear similar things about the United States from the likes of Fareed Zakaria or Charles Kranthammer, that the United States is losing or abdicating its leadership role around the world in turning inward via President Trump's nationalist populist policies. What you'll notice is that this leadership role motif is understood in starkly globalist terms. We're supposed to be a leader in the global economy through our advocacy and practice of so-called free trade, which really is just another word for enriching transnational corporations and CEOs. We're supposed to be a leader in geopolitics, which means militarily intervening dozens upon dozens of foreign conflicts around the world, which supposedly brings about stability in their respective regions. And we're supposed to be leaders morally through the advocacy of human rights and environmental rights and liberal democracy and separation of religion from politics and the championing of gay rights and civil rights and on and on. That's what leadership is in the secular globalist mindset. And if that's the leadership that we're abdicating from, hey, sign me up. Abdicate away, my man. I don't want any part of that. Now, of course, the reality and what the EU is really scared of is that Poland is exercising extraordinary leadership. Poland is emphatically leading the way. Our beloved Eurocrat here alluded to it in her talk. Europe is facing what she called a right-wing crisis. And dare I say, what she really means, or another way of saying it, Europe is experiencing the rise of a new leadership. A new vision of the world is rising that sees nation, culture, tradition, religion, language, and land as central to what it means to be human. Europeans no longer want a world order predicated on laws and protocols and bureaucratic procedures that govern the world in a one-size-fits-all standardization that marginalizes any and all borders, cultures, traditions, customs, and ethnicities. Europe, more and more, wants its continent back, replete with its distinct identities and ethnicities, who are all united in their unique expressions of a single Christian faith, that very faith that the EU refuses to recognize as an intrinsic component to its governance. Hence, as far as the EU is concerned, it doesn't care what religion the sea of refugees that's flooding the continent represents. But I'll tell you who does, and that's the Polish people. Perhaps you heard of thousands of Polish Catholics who formed human chains around the country's borders just this past Saturday, praying that God would save Poland and Europe and the world from Islamization. They recited their rosaries together as a mass spiritual force, and they were lined up along the 2,200-mile line border with Germany and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and the Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania and Russia and the Baltic Sea. And even people in boats joined the event to help the chains across Polish rivers. Now, during the Mass that was held and that was broadcast live on television, the Archbishop of Krakow called on believers to pray for the other European nations, to make them understand, and these are the words of the Archbishop, that it is necessary to return to their Christian roots so that Europe would remain Europe. Europe is a Christian land through and through. Now, here's my question, all of this. Isn't this leadership? Aren't mass prayer groups like this calling God's blessings on Poland and the nations of Europe? Isn't that leadership? Did the EU do this? Did the UN do this? Isn't this leadership? Isn't this precisely the definition of leadership, defined, of course, in historic Christian sense? But no, not if you're the EU. If you're the EU sees this nothing more as a political stunt, an act of stagecraft designed to incite Islamophobia and xenophobia. This isn't the leadership the Eurocrats advocate. And in fact, they believe it's the very opposite of the kind of leadership that Europe and the world needs. However, if you want an example of a political stunt or stagecraft, you need look no further than the EU and their treatment of Poland. You'll notice that the EU has done virtually nothing in terms of threats or intervention when it comes to Spain's handling of the Catalan referendum. Here's a headline from Politico. As Spain falls apart, Europe is tongue-tied. And it goes on to report how almost all of the EU leaders have kept mum in the face of egregious acts of violence committed by the Spanish police and security forces in Catalonia when their referendum to secede passed overwhelmingly by a 90% margin. No, the EU doesn't care about that. The EU wants Spain to stay intact, and it frankly doesn't give a crap how Spanish political thugs keep the status quo in force. But if you have the gall to stand up to the EU and say no when it comes to immigrants, the way Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia have done, well, then you're a threat to the unity and stability of the EU, similar to the Catalans. And if there's no Spanish security force to knock you back in your place, well, then we'll impose our own sanctions and punishments on you. Do you see how it works? Right? It's got not one whit to do. It's got nothing to do with human rights or civil rights or liberal democracy or a people determining their own destiny. If you're a threat to the EU, by definition, you need to be neutralized, whether you're a nationalist, populist Poland or a secessionist Catalonia. It doesn't matter. And so the EU has been, shall we say, harassing Poland over the last several months. The EU calls Poland's retirement standards that allow men to retire at 65 and women to retire at 60 sexist and gender discrimination. That's the EU today. It insists that Poland take on a mass sea of Islamic refugees and immigrants that Angela Merkel had invited in back in 2015. And how has Poland responded? Well, Poland, in fact, has said, look, there's no sanction that you can impose on us that could equate with the social catastrophe of allowing tens of thousands of Muslim refugees and immigrants into our Christian nation. And here's the key. Without those refugees and immigrants prepared to adopt Poland's culture, religion, and way of life, that's the key. That's the qualification that, frankly, Pope Francis seems incapable of understanding. Poland would be happy to take in refugees and immigrants so long as they're prepared to become Christians and to honor and to adhere to the culture and custom, traditions, and way of life that marks the Polish people. And that is what the EU thinks Poland, and that's why the EU thinks Poland is so dangerous. It insists upon its immigrants to adopt its religion, its culture, and its way of life. And that is anathema to globalism. Globalism, by definition, recognizes no religion, no custom, no tradition. Globalism imposes itself on all religions, customs, and traditions without discrimination. It equally hollows out all the identity markers that make historic national populations unique, meaningful, and united, and replaces them with the scientific rationalism of transnational technocratic corporations on the one hand and the human autonomy of human rights, civil rights, and liberal democracy on the other, to thoroughly standardize one-size-fits-all approach to human life and society. Now, for me, the best answer to all this comes from Jaroslaw Kaczynski. He's the leader of the ruling Nationalist Party in Poland, known as the Law and Justice Party. And what he said here is that the burden of dealing with the current migrant crisis in Europe should fall on those countries which encourage the influx, such as Germany, rather than those who opposed it. What do you think of that? How's that for fair? How's that for democratic? The burden of the crisis should fall on those nations that encouraged the crisis, not those who opposed it. Kaczynski said, in effect, look, we Poles didn't exploit the countries where the refugees are arriving from. We didn't insist on their labor force, and we sure as heck didn't call them and invite them to Europe. And so Kaczynski basically argues, look, we'll take part in the EU program for refugees. We'll help out because we're Christian people who are going to come to the aid of those who are in need. Absolutely. However, what we refuse to do is open our nation to the same cultural and demographic and economic catastrophes that the rest of Western Europe is opening itself up to. There's no reason for us to radically lower our living standards and the quality of life in Poland and negate our unique customs, traditions, and way of life to meet the EU's one-size-fits-all standardized, secularized, globalized demands. And we have a full moral right to say no. And no, they have said. Poland is standing up to the EU. They're asserting their sovereignty, their faith, their culture, their people as worthy of protection. And in so doing, they're helping to ignite a nationalist fire throughout Europe. And as that fire sets ablaze, it may most certainly turn out that the greatest threat to the unity and stability of the EU was not the Brexit or even the current immigration and economic crises. No. The greatest threat to the unity and stability of the EU is none other than the prayers, the customs, and the indestructible traditions of Poland itself. God bless.